I'm Christopher Scalia, Director of Academic Programs here at AEI. And today I'm really excited to be speaking to Dr. Diana Schaub about Frederick Douglass's Oration in Memory of Abraham Lincoln. Before getting started, I want to remind you all that we'll be hosting these conversations on Wednesdays, usually at 5:30 p.m. Eastern, through the end of July. So be on the lookout for email invitations and be sure to like and follow us on Facebook and Instagram at AEI for Students to check out our full lineup of speakers. And remember, if you attend 3 or more of our Summer Speaker Series webinars, you'll be automatically entered to a t-shirt giveaway. We'll be posting the design of that t-shirt on Instagram tomorrow. And I know it's more exciting to have t-shirts shot at you from a cannon during sporting events, but there are no sporting events at the moment, and this is much safer anyway. So stay tuned throughout the summer for your chance to win. Our format today is pretty straightforward. Dr. Schaub and I will have a conversation for about 20 minutes, and then I'll turn to your questions. So if you have a question for Dr. Schaub during the webinar, please type it in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen at any time. You don't have to wait until I'm done with my questions to ask yours. In fact, if you do it during the program, we can just jump right into them without any awkward pauses. We'll get to as many of those questions as possible in the last 10 minutes of our session. With that, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Diana Schaub, a visiting scholar at AEI and a professor of political science at Loyola University Maryland, where she has taught for almost 3 decades. Her research focuses on American political thought and history, particularly Abraham Lincoln, Frederick Douglass, African-American political thought, and the relevance of core American ideals to contemporary challenges and debates. This makes her an especially appropriate guest for this summer. Dr. Schaub, thank you very much for joining us tonight. We really appreciate your time.
Happy to be here.
So the subject of today's talk, as I just suggested, is especially relevant given the past several weeks that we've all experienced. And I hope everyone in attendance has a passing familiarity with Frederick Douglass, but just in case, can you just say a few words about his life, what where he came from, what he accomplished, and then why he was invited to deliver this specific speech?
Sure. Frederick Douglass was a leader of tremendous moral and intellectual power. He was also the most famous Black man in America, had been for decades, going all the way back to his days as an abolitionist before the Civil War. He wrote a best-selling autobiography, told the story of his life in slavery, the gripping tale of his escape. He rose to prominence as an orator and strategist in the struggle against slavery. After the war, he's one of the prime movers in the adoption of the 15th Amendment, constitutionalizing the right to vote for African Americans. Hello, Chris. Are you still there?
Yeah, I know. It always happens. I've been doing Zoom long enough to know better, but I still forget to take myself off mute. I have kids in the background. That's why I need to mute myself. But so, can you tell us a little bit about the context of this particular speech? What was the occasion? And I guess you've kind of already clarified why Douglass would be the right man for the job.
The speech was given on the occasion of the unveiling of the Freedman's Monument. This was a statue erected in 1876 in honor of Lincoln. I think it's important to note that the statue was funded entirely by contributions from former slaves, most of them Union veterans. The campaign was begun by an African-American woman who donated the first $5 she earned in freedom in order to express her people's gratitude for this first step toward a fuller life. The statue was the first in the nation to honor the martyred president. It was unveiled on the 11th anniversary of the assassination. The day had actually been declared a federal holiday. It was a huge audience, 25,000 people, both blacks and whites. Much of official Washington was there, President Grant, members of the Supreme Court, many members of Congress. So Douglass was aware that this really was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for him to address an audience like this. It might also be important just to note the wider political moment. Douglass was very worried about the resurgence of the old spirit of the South. Resistance to Reconstruction was growing. So he used this occasion to try to turn the memory of Lincoln into a bulwark against that backlash.
Mm. It's interesting. You mentioned all of the attendees and 25,000 people. It's remarkable, but it's interesting that Douglass really just seems to be addressing the African Americans in the crowd.
Yes and no. At the beginning, it's very clear his audience is, when he says you, I congratulate you, he means the people of his own race. But I think that audience shifts and expands as the logic of the piece unfolds.
Interesting.
So at the very end, he again comes back to his African-American audience, but other things happen in the middle.
Okay, great. Well, maybe we'll touch on those over the course of the rest of my questions. So talk to us a little bit about his relationship with President Lincoln. They had some interaction during Lincoln's life.
And actually there's a lot of new scholarship writing about the relationship between these two men. I mean, in my view, they're the two greatest men of the 19th century. They didn't meet until Lincoln was president, but actually in the 1850s, when Lincoln was engaged in his debates with Stephen Douglas, the other Douglas, he had to fend off the suggestion that there was any connection between this new Republican Party and the radical abolitionists like Frederick Douglass. Then once Lincoln was in the presidency, they met on at least 3 occasions. Douglas sought out interviews with Lincoln in order to lobby. He wanted Lincoln to open up the Union Army to Black enlistments. And then after Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which included the provision for Black entry into the war effort, Douglas pressed further. He argued for equal pay, which wasn't the case initially, and also for the promotion of Black troops. Their final interview was a very brief one. It happened when Douglas attended the reception at the White House after Lincoln's second inaugural. In fact, Lincoln had to intervene to make sure that Douglas was allowed in because the guards actually tried to expel him. According to Douglas's brief account of that interview, Lincoln asked his opinion of the speech, telling him that his was the opinion he was most interested in. Maybe just one other quick comment. I think overall it's clear that Douglas's opinion of Lincoln undergoes a dramatic shift over the course of the war. The earlier editorials that he writes about Lincoln are savage. I mean, they're extremely critical. He hated and mocked the first inaugural. He thought it was much too appeasing in tone. But after the Emancipation Proclamation, his appreciation of Lincoln grows. And after the assassination, Douglas really always speaks admiringly of Lincoln.
That's interesting too. It's fascinating that Lincoln would look to Douglas both after the speech, both suggesting kind of his respect for his ideas, certainly, but also his skills as a speaker.
Yeah.
So let's look at the speech itself for a couple of questions. At one point, this is on page 4 of the PDF for those of you who have that accessible. Douglas says that he and his fellow Black citizens were, quote, at best only Lincoln's stepchildren, children by adoption, children by forces of circumstances and necessity. Yeah. What did he mean by that?
Yeah, Frederick Douglass has a gift for metaphor, and I think this image of Blacks as Lincoln's stepchildren or adopted children is one of his finest. The oath of office that Lincoln took was to the Constitution and the Union as it then existed. Ours is a government based on consent, and the slaves were clearly not part of the population whose consent mattered. Lincoln was elected by whites. That was a fundamental injustice, but it was also a fact. If the president can be understood sort of metaphorically or imaginatively as the father of the country, then it was the white population who were his natural children, so to speak. What happened, though, is as a result of the Civil War, the only way that Lincoln could remain true to his oath of office to save the Union was by freeing the slaves. So Douglass is reminding us that Lincoln was a Unionist first and foremost, and that he became the great emancipator only by force of circumstances and necessity, military necessity. Nonetheless, by that action, the status of Blacks changed dramatically. They became officially part of the American family, first through the executive decree of the Emancipation Proclamation, and then constitutionally through the 13th Amendment, and soon after that, the 14th and 15th Amendments. So that new birth of freedom to include 4 million new citizens is a kind of adoption.
He also, Douglass said, has also spent some time criticizing Lincoln's leadership and his decisions. What is the point of doing that on this occasion? 11 years to the day of Lincoln's assassination. And along those same lines, what lessons might we learn from Douglass's decision to highlight the flaws of the man he so admired and was celebrating at that time?
Yeah, it does come as a bit of a shock. Those of you who have read Douglass's 4th of July oration experienced that same kind of shock, that he would deliver such a speech on such an occasion. But according to Douglass, truth is fitting on all occasions. He's not interested in deifying Lincoln. But I think the order in which the criticisms are presented is very important. He begins with the negative side. And he gives a litany of all of the reasons that Blacks might have doubted Lincoln's intentions. He says, we were at times stunned, grieved, and greatly bewildered. He mentions such things as Lincoln's support for colonization schemes, his refusal initially to enlist Black troops, his revocation of the early emancipation decrees by Union generals in the field. But then he follows that up with a counter litany of the liberationist and racially transformative policies that were begun under Lincoln's administration. He lists 9 achievements, and that culminates in the Emancipation Proclamation. So I think it's almost as if Douglass is recapitulating for his audience his own evolving view of Lincoln. He's really showing how one can move from grievance to gratitude and do so without being false to the full historical context. So I think Douglass is really conveying a crucial lesson about the limits within which democratic statesmen operate. Politicians can't get too far ahead of public opinion if they want to remain politically viable. And as members of a minority, Black citizens must incorporate that insight into their assessment of political figures. So Douglass is really trying to model what it looks like to take a comprehensive view of a politician. So he says that you have to make reasonable allowance for the circumstances. You shouldn't judge on the basis of stray utterances or isolated facts. His people are new voters. They're not very practiced at this. And there are 2 dangers that he wants them to avoid. He doesn't want them to look to politics for a Moses. So he doesn't want the idolization of Lincoln. But he also doesn't want them to fall into the opposite error of cynically only seeing the flaws. So I think he's trying to show what balanced judgment looks like.
You mentioned earlier that at some points in his speech, towards the middle of the speech, Douglass moves from speaking to the freed slaves to speaking to the white members of the audience. About when does he do that, and what point is he trying to make to them?
That actually comes in the 3rd section. I think the sections are divided by these repeated phrases where he says, friends and fellow citizens or fellow citizens. So in the first 2 of those sections, he says friends and fellow citizens. And that means he's really speaking to the Black audience and also to just the whites who are in attendance there, who could be sort of presumed to be friendly by the fact that they are in attendance. But then in the 3rd section, he simply says fellow citizens. And there I think he is speaking to this wider American audience, and many of them are not friends. And it's really at that point that he sort of pulls back from Lincoln, and he wants to make sure that whites continue to celebrate Lincoln. He doesn't want to interfere with their celebration, and their celebration of Lincoln is for saving the Union. And he sort of says, we blacks have a different reason for celebrating Lincoln. It's for emancipation. So his first suggestion, I think, is that you can have these racially distinct celebrations. And it's in that context that he mentions many of the ways in which he associates Lincoln with whites. He says he was, first and foremost president, a white president for whites.
We have about 5 more minutes until we turn it over to questions from attendees. So if you have any questions, please type them in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Until then, I've got a couple more I want to ask Dr. Schaub. So on page 9, the PDF we sent around, Douglass said, "Happily for the country, happily for you and me, the judgment of James Buchanan, the patrician, was not the judgment of Abraham Lincoln, the plebeian." What did he mean by this? What was it about Lincoln's background and experience that made Douglass think really helped Lincoln excel and become a great president? I think sort of what he's doing at this moment is he's shifting from that racial analysis, and he's in a way now transcended that separate race-based consideration of Lincoln, and he is replacing the racial division with a class division. And the division between the patrician, James Buchanan, who was willing to allow the nation to perish, who did nothing to impede the slaveholding secessionists, and the plebeian, Abraham Lincoln, who kept his oath, an honest man, right? His oath to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. So I think Douglass is suggesting that the division that really matters is the one between patriotism and treason. And then Douglass does link this patriotism to Lincoln's humble origins. Another line from that section is where he says, "A son of toil himself, he was linked in brotherly sympathy with the sons of toil in every loyal part of the republic." Here, I think part of what Douglass is doing is he's trying to head off the tendency of poor whites to be bought off by the consolations of white supremacy. He wants white and black laborers to see that they have a common interest in greater economic opportunity. They shouldn't allow themselves to be set against one another. At this point, many of the skilled trades were, ruthlessly excluding black laborers. And part of Douglass's post-war activities involved the rights of laborers. So I think this section is in a way part of that project. Yeah. So let's turn to today and what this speech might mean for us today, especially in the context of the last few weeks. What are some important lessons American readers can draw from Douglass's address and or his relationship with Lincoln? What can these things teach us about our past and our present moment?
Especially at this moment, protests erupting over incidents of racial injustice, as well as over statues and memorials that are thought to symbolize such injustice. I cannot think of a better resource than Frederick Douglass. He's one of our nation's greatest fighters against injustice, and he took very seriously this topic of public commemoration. It matters intensely who and what and how we memorialize the past. Let me just mention a couple of things that I think distinguish Douglass from today's protesters and progressives. While Douglass was a fierce critic of our national transgressions, he always believed in the American project. He considered the principles of the Declaration of Independence to be saving principles. He considered the Constitution to be a great liberty document. He criticized the nation from the perspective of its own highest ideals, calling on us to live up to those ideals. He could be satirical, but he never became cynical. He was always ready to find and praise what was good and generous and true in the American experiment. I am worried that spirit is not present in the current Black Lives Matter movement. There's a very deep alienation expressed in both the rhetoric and action of the movement. That alienation has many causes. but it strikes me as much more dangerous virus than COVID-19. COVID threatens the physical and psychic health of many individuals, and it threatens the economic health of the nation. But the alienation of citizens' affections for the nation threatens the health of the republic altogether. And if you've been following the news just the last couple of days, there are now calls to take down that Emancipation Memorial. And so if we've now arrived at the point that the statue to Lincoln, whose dedication was the occasion for Douglass's speech, if that's now threatened with being toppled by the protesters, I would say that the animus against the nation is spiraling out of control. Careful reading of the speech might rescue us, and might rescue the statue too.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up. John Sabella, in the first question for you from our students, asks
can I see these questions also? If
I can read them to you, but yeah, if you
click on, I think I've got the Q&A.
Yeah, if you click on the Q&A there. Yeah. So John's up top there, and he wants to know, you addressed this just briefly, but what are your thoughts about the move to remove the Emancipation Memorial? I think protesters yesterday threatened to tear it down Thursday at 7 o'clock.
I've actually, as a result of the clip that Chris sent me, when these protests began at that monument, I got up at 4 this morning and just written an op-ed. So I don't know if I want to give away everything I'm kind of saying in that op-ed. But one of the things that I point out there is that Frederick Douglass himself was not all that happy with the design of the statue. He thought it didn't acknowledge enough sort of Black agency and Black participation in emancipation. So, that dissatisfaction with the portrayal began when it was unveiled and, is still present today, or even more today. So I guess my thoughts are a little divided. I mean, certainly putting the statue in a museum, which is what Eleanor Holmes Norton is proposing, is better than allowing it to be destroyed. On the other hand, I do think that does a kind of disservice to all of those African Americans who donated their quarters and nickels in order to erect that statue.
I am sending a link in the chat function to everybody. Don't read this article yet, but copy that link. It's a Washington Post article from a couple of years ago that goes into a little bit about the story behind the design and the controversy of the design. It's a fascinating story. And we look forward to reading your op-ed in the Post, Dr. Schaub. All right, our next question is from Luis Perales. He points out that one of the interesting questions in conservative political thought hinges on a general disposition towards stability and gradual change. For example, Edmund Burke. He's not American, but we can talk about him anyway. Yet one of the biggest challenges to this disposition centers on how we deal with offenses against fundamental demands of justice. What did Frederick Douglass think about the balance of gradual change on one hand and demands of justice on the other?
It's a good question. Douglass is almost always on the side, at least when it comes to these fundamental wrongs, of immediate change. So he begins as a Garrisonian abolitionist. They called for immediate emancipation. So he was not a gradualist on the matter of slavery. Even after he leaves the Garrisonians and moves to the Liberty Party, where he becomes willing to work through the political process, there's a little bit more, there's a kind of growing acknowledgement then that if you're working through this political process, it's going to take a little bit longer. But he still, I think, always moves in the direction of faster. And so that makes his interactions with Lincoln interesting, because Lincoln is, while he certainly believes in the principles of natural right, is much more Burkean in his notions about political prudence.
Mm-hmm.
So I think this oration on Lincoln is really interesting because you see the agitator. You know, Douglass is an activist and an agitator. You see him coming to terms with the legacy of Lincoln and what a person of goodwill can really accomplish when they manifest this kind of highest degree of political prudence and statesmanship.
Mary Catherine Daigle wants to know, how do you as an American historian balance admiration and disapproval for those whom you study? In a larger sense, how do we remember and honor where we come from while also acknowledging the great evil that has occurred against people in the nation?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I guess I'm really drawn to studying those I admire rather than those I disapprove of. And I think it's very possible to admire both Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln, and actually through the two of them to admire the founders as well. I think probably the two of them are our best way back to the founders. Both of them had tremendous appreciation for the founding and the principles of the founding, and they, while being critics of the pre-existing wrong of slavery. So I think they help us to think about, how did the founders position themselves with respect to this wrong?
I think we have time probably for one more question, and I'm going to give that honor to Alicia Jacobson because she attends the University of Wisconsin in Madison, which is having its own statue troubles. A couple were torn down last night, including one of an abolitionist and somebody who fought to capture slave capturers or fight people trying to capture slaves. But so she wants to know, looking specifically at the oration itself, what does Douglass mean when he says that the events of the day, quote, have also been defending ourselves from a blighting scandal, unquote? What scandal is he referring to there?
I think that's actually a typo. I think it's blighting slander. But in any case, what he means is that there is a kind of accusation out there made by whites against blacks that blacks don't manifest these higher possibilities of generosity and citizenship and gratitude. And so what Douglass says is that whenever that's thrown up in our face, right, we can point to this monument, right, that we erected this monument to an important public man, as a show of our generosity, our capacity for honor. And so it's really interesting that both at the beginning and the end of the speech, Douglass says that in honoring Lincoln, African Americans are really giving greatest honor to themselves. They're making their mark on the national stage by doing this. I guess it's another reason why shelving the monument. According to Douglass, this was his people's first national act. First national act. We should probably, it's best if we edit stop it there. We have one more question, but we should close things out now. Okay, so they could send it to me by email.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Schaub. Really appreciate your time and sharing your insights, and look forward to seeing your piece in the Post if they're smart enough to accept it.
Yeah, well, I haven't heard yet.
Yeah. And thank everybody for tuning in and for your questions. We hope you can join us again next Wednesday. The time's a little bit different. We're going to be at 1 p.m. Eastern. We'll be speaking to AEI's Dan Cox about dating during the Trump era. So keep an eye out for that invitation tomorrow. You can also preview our July webinar lineup on Facebook or Instagram at AEI for Students. Finally, if you have any friends in college who are interested in these types of conversations, please invite them to sign up for our student network to receive invitations to the Student Speaker Series and learn more about the different opportunities that AEI has for students. Thank you all for joining, and we'll see you next week.
Great.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.